This week's Grimm Fairy Tales, Herr Korbes. Once a cock and a hen who wanted to take a journey together. So the cock built a beautiful carriage, which had 4 red wheels and harnessed 4 mice to it. The hen seated herself in it with the cock, and they drove away together. Not long afterwards, they met a cat who said, "Where are you going?" The cock replied, "We're going to the house of Herr Korbes." "Take me with you," said the cat. The cock answered, "Most willingly. Get up behind, lest you fall off in front. Take great care not to dirty my little red wheels, and you little red wheels roll on, and you little mice pipe out, as we go forth on our way to the house of Herr Korbes." After this came a millstone, then an egg, then a duck, then a pin, and at last a needle, who all seated themselves in the carriage and drove with him. When, however, they reached the house of Herr Korbes was not there. The mice drew the carriage into the barn. The hen flew with the cock upon a perch. The cat sat down by the hearth. The duck on the well pole. The egg rolled itself into a towel. The pin stuck itself into the chair cushion. The needle jumped onto the bed in the middle of the pillow, and the millstone laid itself over the door. Then Herr Korbes came home, went to the hearth, and was about to light the fire, when the cat threw a quantity of ashes in his face. He ran into the kitchen in a great hurry to wash it off, and the duck splashed some water in his face. He wanted to dry it with the towel, but the egg rolled up against him, broke, and glued up his eyes. He wanted to rest and sat down in the chair, and then the pin pricked him. He fell in a passion and threw himself on his bed. But as soon as he laid his head on the pillow, the needle pricked him, so that he screamed aloud and was just going to run out into the wide world in his rage. But when he came to the house door, the millstone leapt down and struck him dead. Herr Korbes must have been a very wicked man. The Pack of Ragamuffins. The cock once said to the hen, "It is now the time when our nuts are ripe, so let us go to the hill together and for once eat our fill before the squirrel takes them all away." "Yes," replied the hen. "Come, we will have some pleasure together." Then they went away to the hill, and on it was a bright day. They stayed till evening. Now I do not know whether it was that they had eaten till they were too fat, or whether they had become proud, but they would not go home on foot, and the cock had to build a little carriage of nutshells. When it was ready, the little hen seated herself in it and said to the cock, "Thou canst just harness thyself to it." "I like that," said the cock. "I would rather go home on foot than let myself be harnessed to it. No, that is not our bargain. I do not mind being coachman and sitting on the box, but drag it myself I will not." As they were thus disputing, a duck quacked to them.
"You thieving folks, you bade you go to my nut hill? Wait, you shall suffer for it,"
and ran with open beak at the cock. But the cock also was not idle, and fell boldly on the duck, and at last wounded her so with his spurs that she also begged for mercy, and willingly let herself be harnessed to the carriage as a punishment. The little cock now seated himself on the box and was coachman, and thereupon they went off in a gallop with, "Duck, go, as fast as thou canst." When they had driven a part of the way, they met 2 foot passengers, a pin and a needle. They cried, "Stop, stop," and said that it would soon be as dark as pitch, and they could not go a step further, and that it was so dirty on the road, and asked if they could not get into the carriage for a while. They had been at the tailor's public house by the gate, and had stayed too long over the beer. As they were thin people who did not take up much room, the cock let them both get in, but they had to promise him and his little hen not to step on their feet. Late in the evening they came to an inn, and as they did not like to go further by night, and as the duck also was not strong on her feet, and fell from one side to the other, they went in. The host at first made many objections. His house was already full. Besides, he thought they could not be very distinguished persons. But at last, as they made pleasant speeches, and told him that he should have the egg which the little hen has laid on the way, and should likewise keep the duck which laid one every day, he at length said that they might stay the night, and now they had themselves well served, and feasted and rioted. Early in the morning, when day was breaking, and everyone was asleep, the cock awoke the hen, brought the egg, pecked it open, and they ate it together. But they drew the shell on the hearth. Then they went to the needle, which was still asleep, took it by the head and stuck it into the cushion of the landlord's chair, and put the pin in his towel, and at the last, without more ado, they flew away over the heath. The duck, who liked to sleep in the open air and had stayed in the yard, heard them going away, made herself merry and found a stream, down which she swam, which was a much quicker way of traveling than being harnessed to a carriage. The host did not get out of bed for 2 hours after this. He washed himself and wanted to dry himself, and then the pin went over his face and made a red streak from one ear to the other. After this, he went into the kitchen and wanted to light a pipe, but when he came to the hearth, the eggshell darted into his eyes. "This morning everything attacks my head," he said, and angrily sat down on his grandfather's chair. But he quickly started up again and cried, "Woe is me!" For the needle had pricked him still worse than the pin, and not in the head. Now he was thoroughly angry, and suspected the guests who had come so late the night before, and when he went and looked about for them, they were gone. Then he made a vow to take no more ragamuffins into his house, for they consume much, pay for nothing, and play mischievous tricks into the bargain by way of gratitude. The Death of the Little Hen. Once upon a time, the little hen went with the little cock to the nut hill, and they agreed together that whichsoever of them found a kernel of a nut should share it with the other. Then the hen found a large nut, but said nothing about it, intending to eat the kernel herself. The kernel, however, was so large that she could not swallow it, and it remained sticking in her throat, so that she was alarmed lest she should be choked. Then she cried, "Cock, I entreat thee to run as fast as thou canst, and fetch me some water, or I shall choke." The little cock did run as fast as he could to the spring and said, "Stream, thou art to give me some water. The little hen is lying on the nut hill, and she has swallowed a large nut and is choking." The well answered, "First run to the bride and get her to give thee some red silk." The little cock ran to the bride and said, "Bride, you are to give me some red silk. I wanted to give red silk to the well, and the well is to give me some water. I am to take the water to the little hen, who is lying on the nut hill, and has swallowed a great nut kernel, and is choking with it." The bride answered, "First run and bring me my little wreath, which is hanging to a willow." So the little cock ran to the willow, and drew the wreath from the branch, and took it to the bride, and the bride gave him some water for it. Then the little cock took the water to the hen, but when he got there, the hen had choked in the meantime and lay there dead and motionless. Then the little cock was so distressed that he cried aloud, and every animal came to lament the little hen. And 6 mice built a little carriage to carry her to her grave. And when the carriage was ready, they harnessed themselves to it, and the cock drove. On the way, however, they met the fox, who said, "Where art thou going, little cock?" "I am going to bury my little hen." "May I drive with thee?" "Yes, but seat thyself at the back of the carriage, for in the front my little horses could not drag thee." Then the fox seated himself at the back, and after that the wolf, the bear, the stag, the lion, and all the beasts of the forest did the same. Then the procession went onwards, and they reached the stream. "How are we to get over?" said the little cock. A straw was lying by the stream, and it said, "I will lay myself across, and you shall drive over me." But when the 6 mice came to the bridge, the straw slipped and fell into the water, and the 6 mice all fell in and were drowned. Then they were again in difficulty, and a coal came and said, "I am large enough. I will lay myself across, and you shall drive over me." So the coal also laid itself across the water, but unhappily just touched it, on which the coal hissed, was extinguished, and died. When a stone saw that, it took pity on the little cock, wished to help him, and laid itself over the water. Then the cock drew the carriage himself, but when he got it over and reached the other shore with the dead hen, and was about to draw over the others who were sitting behind as well, there were too many of them. The carriage ran back, and they all fell into the water together and were drowned. Then the little cock was left alone with the dead hen, and dug a grave for her, and laid her in it, and made a mound above it, on which he sat down and fretted, until he died too, and then everyone was dead. The Owl. 200 or 300 years ago, when people were far from being so crafty and cunning as they are nowadays, an extraordinary event took place in a little town. By some mischance, one of the great owls, called horned owls, had come from the neighboring woods into the barn of one of the townsfolk in the nighttime, and when day broke, did not dare to venture forth again from her retreat, for fear of the other birds, which raised a terrible outcry whenever she appeared. In the morning, when the manservant went into the barn to fetch some straw, he was so mightily alarmed at the sight of the owl sitting there in a corner, that he ran away and announced to his master that a monster, the like of which he had never set eyes on in his life, and which could devour a man without the slightest difficulty, was sitting in the barn, rolling its eyes about in its head. "I know you already," said the master. "You have courage enough to chase a blackbird about the fields, but when you see a dead hen lying, you have to get a stick before you go near it. I must go see for myself what kind of monster it is," added the master, and went quite boldly into the granary and looked round him, when, however, he saw the strange grim creature with his own eyes. He was no less terrified than the servant had been. With 2 bounds, he sprang out, ran to his neighbors, and begged them imploringly to lend him assistance against an unknown and dangerous beast, or else the whole town might be in danger if it were to break loose out of the barn where it was shut up. A great noise and clamor arose in all the streets. The townsmen came armed with spears, hay forks, scythes, and axes, as if they were going out against an enemy. Finally, the senators appeared with the burgomaster at their head. When they had drawn up in the marketplace, they marched to the barn and surrounded it on all sides. Thereupon, one of the most courageous of them stepped forth and entered with his spear lowered, but came running out immediately afterwards with a shriek and as pale as death, and could not utter a single word. Yet 2 others ventured in, but they fared no better. At last one stepped forth, a great strong man who was famous for his warlike deeds, and said, "You will not drive away the monster by merely looking at him. We must be in earnest here, but I see that you all have turned into women, and not one of you dares to encounter the animal." He ordered them to give him some armor, had a sword and spear brought, and armed himself. All praised his courage, though many feared for his life. The 2 barn doors were opened, and they saw the owl, which in the meantime had perched herself on the middle of a great crossbeam. He had a ladder brought, and when he raised it and made ready to climb up, they all cried out to him that he was to bear himself bravely, and commended him to St. George who slew the dragon. When he had just got to the top, and the owl perceived that he had designs on her, and was also bewildered by the crowd and the shouting, and knew not how to escape, she rolled her eyes, ruffled her feathers, flapped her wings, and snapped her beak, and cried, "To-whit, to-hoo," in a harsh voice. "Strike home! Strike home!" screamed the crowd outside to the valiant hero. "Anyone who was standing where I am standing," answered he, "would not cry, 'Strike home.'" He certainly did plant his foot 1 rung higher on the ladder, but then he began to tremble, and half fainting, went back again. And now there was no one left who dared to put himself in such danger. "The monster," said they, "has poisoned and mortally wounded the very strongest man among us, by snapping at him and just breathing on him. Are we too to risk our lives?" They took counsel as to what they ought to do to prevent the whole town being destroyed. For a long time everything seemed to be of no use, but at length the burgomaster found an expedient. "My opinion," said he, "is that we ought, out of the common purse, to pay for this barn, and whatsoever corn, straw, or hay contains, and thus indemnify the owner, and then burn down the whole thing, and the terrible beast with it. Thus no one will have to endanger his life. This is no time for thinking of expense, and regardlessness would be ill applied." All agreed with him, so they set fire to the barn at all 4 corners, and with it the owl was miserably burnt. Let anyone who will not believe it go thither and inquire for himself.